Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. As I said, I'm Will Johnson. I'm joined by Perry McLennan with Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd. And we also have Keely Yates, our marketing director, who spearheaded this effort and pulled all of this together. So we're happy to have you with us today to talk about the Paycheck Protection Program. It's certainly been in the news quite a lot over the last few weeks. As most or all of you know, by this point in time, the program was initially set for $349 billion in funding. That funding was reached last week. And as of last night, the latest word that I've seen is that congressional leaders in the White House are very close to extending that cap or increasing that cap so that the program would be reopened. I don't have this information in the slides, which we'll come to, but I'll share a couple of statistics just that I thought were interesting. There were over $1.6 million, over 1.6 million loans approved. In South Carolina, there were almost 23,000 loans approved for a total of $3.8 billion in funds. There's been a lot of criticism that I've seen about this idea that loans have not gone to small businesses. In fact, 74% of the loans that were approved were for $150,000 or less. An additional 13.5% of loans were between $150,000 and $300,000. So all total, almost 88% of the loans that were approved were under $300,000. I hope that the program, will be subject to additional congressional action this week so that it can continue. I think it's doing some great work protecting payroll all across the country, and we're looking forward to talking to you about that today. So I'll turn things over to my colleague, Perry McLennan, who will give you an introduction, and then I'll be back a little later to talk about loan forgiveness.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us today. Keely, I'm having a little bit of a hard time advancing the slides. I'm not sure if it's on a delay, or can you try advancing from your end? All right. So I think everybody on the webinar this morning probably has an idea of what the PPP is, but the Paycheck Protection Program was part of this overall federal stimulus bill that was U.S. Congress's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Paycheck Protection Program is administered by the Small Business Administration, but unlike the economic disaster injury loan that some of you may be familiar with, that you apply for directly with the SBA, these PPP loans, you actually have to apply through a private financial institution. Most of our clients and the folks that we've spoken with have used existing banking contacts and existing banking relationships to apply for these loans. I think the process is a little bit easier that way, and some banks have required an existing relationship, or at least processed loans for existing customers first. So the idea of the program is to provide forgivable loans to small businesses in order to maintain payroll and keep workers employed at or near current wage levels. And it's really a 2-month period that it's intended to provide payroll funds for. I think it's important to just keep this general idea and spirit of the law in mind and what it's designed for. In speaking with clients over the last couple of weeks, I've gone back several times and explained to clients sort of what the overall purpose of the law is, because I think it helps us with some of the interpretations. There's a lot of provisions of this law and the subsequent guidance that we have received that's been less than clear, I would say, and open to interpretation. And I think it's smart to keep in mind that the idea here is to provide a loan that can be forgiven, provided that the majority of those funds are used for payroll in the 2-month period after you receive the loans. So in order to receive the forgiveness, at least 75% of the loan proceeds must be used for payroll during the 8-week period. Up to 25% of the loan can be used for other eligible costs, which we'll talk about what those are in a little bit more detail, but generally it's rent, mortgage interest, utility payments, things like that. The idea here is that the loans are going to be forgiven if you comply with the requirements of the law. But even if you have to reduce some of your forgiveness and pay back a portion of the loan terms are very favorable, which makes this program even more attractive. So as Will mentioned at the top, the Small Business Administration announced last week that it had reached the cap that for Congress's funding appropriation. And so currently the Small Business Administration has suspended intake of new applications. It's going to be up to each financial institution to determine whether or not during this period until Congress approves new funding, whether or not they're going to accept new applications. So if you have not gotten an application in yet, and you are thinking about or intend to apply for this program once Congress approves new funding, I think it's smart to go ahead and start working on that. Go ahead and get all your paperwork in order. Check with your bank to see if they're actually accepting applications at this time, and whether or not they'll allow you to get in the queue for approval once new funding is appropriated. Because as we saw with the last round, it's kind of a first come, first serve program. So you definitely want to be proactive about getting in line once this new funding is appropriated. And we do expect, as Will said just last night and this morning, it seems like Congress is being called back to Washington as early as Wednesday of this week. It seems like a deal on this is imminent. Not sure how quickly the funding will get out, but it should be a matter of days or a couple of weeks max once the new funding is approved. And we're not exactly sure. I've had a couple of clients reach out and tell me that they're in the queue, and that the bank has told them that they've got all the information they need, but they have not received funding. I'm not, as of last week when the SBA announced this, their money was approved, but not everyone had actually received their loan funds. So I guess there's still a chance that you could have been approved in the first round and not receive your loan funds. But if you have not up to this point, you're probably going to need to rely on the second round of funding. Okay, I'm going to continue to go over a few of the eligibility requirements. These are mostly for those of you who have not yet applied or have applications in the queue. Eligibility is really aimed at small businesses, and the way they define small businesses, there's a couple of different ways that you could qualify. Any small business concern, private organization, 501c3 nonprofit, other not-for-profits, if you're not a 501c3, may not be eligible. Veterans organizations or tribal business concern, all is defined by the SBA. There is a 500 employee cap that if you're over 500 employees, which includes full and part-time workers, you are not eligible. I would caution you that there are sort of a few exceptions and workarounds to that 500 cap. So if you're over the 500 cap or you're close, I would not automatically write off this program. There are a few exceptions to that. One of those is that if you're over 500 employees, you may still qualify if you otherwise meet the SBA's traditional size standards, and that's based on your NAICS industry classification code, and you can look up those online, and we can help you with that as well. Importantly, sort of throughout this law, one of the things that we're hoping for some clarity on is in regards to U.S. residency requirements. The 500 employee cap is, you can only include folks that their principal place of residence is in the United States. We don't have a definition of that yet. Also excluded from the definition of payroll costs, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that same issue. So we're hoping for some clarity on that. Finally, there's an alternative size standard that if you're over 500, you may be able to qualify. And that's if, as of March 27th, 2020, your maximum tangible net worth is not exceeding 15 million and the average net income for the last 2 fiscal years of not more than $5 million. A couple of other points on eligibility for the program. Certain businesses are excluded per the language of the act, such as banks, private clubs that limit membership, and certain private equity owned companies as well. One of the questions that we have received from a lot of clients is concerning foreign owned entities. We've heard anecdotally from the Small Business Administration that they've taken a position that directly foreign owned businesses do not qualify for this program. That does not seem to be consistent with the text of the law and the guidance that we have subsequently received. And we believe some entities that are foreign owned may have actually gotten through this and received loan funding. Certain banks have different requirements on this, but we have seen that some entities, depending on how you are structured, may have some trouble filling out the application. For instance, if you need if you need to provide an EIN number for the foreign owner or something like that. So we're hoping for some clarity on the foreign owned entity question. And we're hoping to get that guidance here pretty soon. All right. So how much money can you receive? The lesser of your average monthly payroll times 2.5 or $10 million, whatever is the lesser of two. So I've got the example up there. If your average monthly payroll in the measurement period was $900,000, you would be eligible for a loan of up to $2.25 million. So you can see again what the intent of the program is. Look at your average monthly payroll, multiply that times 2, because they're trying to cover 2 months worth of payroll costs, and they've added the 2.5 in there so that you might have a little bit of extra funding available after you cover the 2 months of payroll to apply towards those other eligible expenses like rent, utilities, things like that. So you've got 2 periods that you can look at to determine what your average monthly payroll is. That can be either calendar year 2019, which it seems like most of the clients I worked with used, or you can use the most recent 12-month period prior to the loan date. So if you apply for the loan in this next round and you apply on May 1st, you could use April 30th, 2019 to April 30th, 2020 as your average monthly payroll. Probably makes sense to look at whichever one of those two is the greater. Okay, so one of the big questions under this program is what is included in payroll costs. So this definition of payroll costs obviously comes up in the context that I just discussed, which is determining how much money you can get. But that definition also appears in the provisions about how you can use the loan funds and what your potential forgiveness looks like. The definition of payroll costs is the same throughout the act, but the time periods of how they're captured are different. So what the act says payroll costs include are salary, wages, commissions, and cash tips limited to $100,000 per employee per year. So annual cash compensation of $100,000. So for any employee that makes over $100,000 in cash compensation per year, you just treat that person for payroll cost here as if they make $100,000. There was an initial question as to whether the $100,000 included all of these other types of compensation, such as payment for vacation, health insurance, that kind of thing. And we received subsequent guidance that the $100,000 cap only applies to the cash compensation portion. So that's important to keep in mind. But payroll costs also include the payment for things such as vacation, sick leave. Although I will point out that if you're paying sick leave pursuant to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, then those are eligible for reimbursement under that act. Those are not included within payroll costs for purposes of this law. Keely, I lost the slide deck on my side. Are y'all still seeing it? All right, thanks. So severance is also included. I've had a couple of questions from clients about potentially paying out severance to employees after they receive the loan funds. That is considered a payroll cost here. Group health coverage, retirement benefits, unemployment tax, all of those things are included within the definition of payroll costs. Interestingly, payroll costs do not include the employer's share of the payroll tax, but this is gross costs. So when you're determining your loan amount, you look at the payroll costs, prior to reducing for tax withholding. So it's gross costs, not net, but it does not include the employer share of the payroll tax there. All right. A couple of additional points on payroll costs. Payments to non-U.S. residents are not included. As I mentioned, we don't have a clarity on what this means yet. Had some informal indications that U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, green card holders, are included. We are not sure about those that are authorized to work in the U.S. under one of the visa programs, whether or not those are included. So we're going to continue to monitor that situation. Payments to independent contractors are not included. So this is important to keep in mind. I had some clients include this type of compensation when they sought their loan amount. And so now they're having to figure out what to do, if they get this loan funding. I know a lot of companies out there do use 1099 workers. So please keep that in mind. Had a lot of questions about temporary employees. The language of the law says that temporary employees are included. Now, a lot of people mean very different things when they refer to temporary employees. What the act means by temporary employees is, I think, more of the, part-time seasonal worker type person. Those that are, in an initial hiring period or probationary period, or are on payroll for, a certain amount of time working on a certain project. Those type of sort of temp employees would be included. It gets a little bit more difficult when you've got temp employees that are not actually on your payroll, but that you hire through, let's say, a staffing agency or something like that. The guidance that we receive says that workers hired through a professional employer organization are included, but those that are hired through a staffing agency, where the staffing agency is actually the one that is the employer of record, and the staffing agency is actually paying the workers, and you're just paying the staffing agency a fee, those would generally not be included. That would be up to the staffing agency to apply for a PPP for their employees. So you would not include those workers. All right, Will, I'll toss it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Barry. And I'll just say a couple of questions have come in, but you're welcome to use the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. I think I've seen maybe 3 come in so far that I've knocked out. So if a bunch come in all at once, we may get behind, and if we don't finish them, please feel free to email us after the program, but you are welcome to ask those questions as we go. So I might be doing this in reverse order because I'll talk mostly about loan forgiveness. But in the meantime, the terms of the loan are very favorable, and really the terms of the loan are only relevant for the amount of the loan that is not forgiven. And so if you do receive a loan amount and forgiveness is less than 100%, this slide pretty much summarizes the terms of that loan. It would be a 2-year term loan with 1% interest, no payments due for 6 months, no prepayment penalties, no application fees. As a side note, I would say the banks are earning fees, but the fees are paid directly through the SBA, and there are no personal guarantees or collateral. So, extremely favorable loan terms. The proceeds of the loans can be used for 4 items: payroll costs, rent, utilities, and interest. Interestingly, there is one difference that I'm not sure was intentional, but for purposes of the loan proceeds, just eligible uses of the funds, any type of interest on debt that was in place as of February 15th is eligible. As we'll talk about in a minute, for forgiveness, only interest on secured debt is eligible. So kind of a curious difference there, but it is there. I want to make this very clear before I really start getting into the programs. One of the most common misconceptions that I'm hearing, and I've heard it quite a lot, is people feel like even if they lay off employees, or if they reduce wages, as long as they restore the employees and restore the wages by June 30th, then they're good. Then the entire loan amount is forgiven. That is not correct. And that's one of the biggest takeaways that I hope you'll get from this discussion. So I'm going to go into it in more detail right now. But I just want to say you really have to keep in mind that there are separate calculations with separate time periods. Even though it might not necessarily make sense that the time periods don't match up, you have to go through this analysis separately. You have to look at, number 1, what is the maximum loan amount? Number 2, what is the maximum amount of that loan that can be forgiven? And then number 3, let's look at the issues in terms of whether that maximum loan amount, as to whether that maximum forgiveness amount will be 100% forgiven. Very important to keep in mind that those are 3 separate calculations. And here in the first bullet point of this slide, I'm just reiterating that point again. In terms of the maximum loan forgiveness amount, we are looking at qualifying costs paid in the 8-week period after receipt of loan funds. And so the qualifying costs, as I mentioned a minute ago, 4 items: payroll costs, rent, utilities, and interest on secured debt. In terms of rent, utilities, and interest, whatever services or obligations, contracts, or underlying those obligations have to have been in place as of February 15th. I feel like I'm learning open issues every day just over the weekend, I had someone point out that there is a question over whether rent for rental cars would be eligible rent. And my first thought was, no, that can't be right. But I went back to the CARES Act, read the definition, and I would say that it's not clear that that would be prohibited. And so if a company does use a rental car fleet, maybe an open question, and I'm sure that the rental car companies will be lobbying hard to get some regulations clarifying that. One thing that was not in the act itself, but has been in the SBA guidance and Treasury guidance that have been issued after the act was enacted, is that no more than 25% of the forgiveness can be for non-payroll. So at least 75% of the amount of loan forgiveness must be payroll. That rule applies both for the actual loan proceeds and for the loan forgiveness amount. The loan forgiveness amount is capped at 100% of the actual loan amount. So just because you have more qualifying costs in that 8-week period starting on the loan date than the actual total amount, you can't get more than the loan amount forgiven. That maybe seems obvious, but it is a question that some people asked, and it is clear in the act. There is a potential reduction in the forgiveness amount if there is a headcount or wage reduction in the 8-week period that starts on the date of loan funding. So I'll take these two components separately. First, in terms of headcount, a little bit of a complicated calculation, but we start with a base employment. So I'll go to the second bullet point first. In terms of measuring whether we have a headcount reduction, we have to first say, what are we comparing our current headcount to? And the answer is that the employer has a choice. The base employment number can be measured during the period from February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, or January 1st to February 29th, 2020. Couple of caveats there. If you are a seasonal business, you have to use the February 15th to June 30th, 2019 time period. And then the other caveat is this is all measured by full-time equivalents. The Act does not define that term, and the guidance issued so far has not defined that term either. So our best guess would be that there would be a total of hours worked for all employees, and that it would be divided by something like 40 hours or 37.5 hours, but we haven't seen that yet. Once the base employment number is determined, then you look at the average number of full-time equivalents within the 8-week period starting on the funding date. And when you take that number within the 8-week period and divide it by base employment, then you get a percentage. Let's say that your percentage is 90%. Well, in that case, your maximum forgiveness amount would be reduced by 10%. All right, in addition to headcount reductions, there is also a reduction in the loan forgiveness amount if employee wages are reduced. And the way that this item works is that your loan forgiveness amount is reduced dollar for dollar for any reduction in wages of more than 25% for any individual employee. Now, there is a kind of an open question here, because we do, as the last bullet point notes, we have a mismatch in time periods right now. What the Act says is that this reduction applies if any employee's wages are decreased during the 8-week period starting on the loan funding date versus what the employee was paid in the first quarter. Well, the first quarter was a 13-week period. 8 divided by 13 is somewhere around 66%. And so surely if an employee was paid the same amount on a weekly basis during that same time period, surely there was not an intent that the loan forgiveness amount would be reduced. But we are waiting for clarity on that. Only the amount that's over and above the 25% reduces the loan forgiveness amount. So that's an important point. Let's assume that we can get the way that we make the calculation straight. If we then look and say, okay, during the first quarter on an average weekly basis for 8 weeks, an employee was paid $10,000. And then during the 8-week period starting on the loan date, that employee was paid $7,000. Well, that would be a 30% reduction. but 75% of 10,000 would be 7,500. So the actual dollar for dollar reduction in that example would be $500. We are still waiting for a little bit of clarity there. Another important point is that the wage reduction only applies to employees who were not paid over $100,000 per year in 2019. And then here's the important part, on an annualized basis based on any pay period. So I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of strategies. All right, so now the forgiveness piece gets even a little bit more complicated. You apply the headcount reduction and the wage reduction the way that I've just described. If under those rules you're at 100% and you get to have your entire maximum loan amount forgiveness actually forgiven, then you can disregard this next step. But let's say that you've calculated your maximum loan amount, you've looked at your headcount and wage reductions, and you would face a 10% reduction for headcount and a $20,000 reduction for wages. Well, there's a rather convoluted rule, which is basically an exception to the exception. So if you were going to have a headcount or wage reduction, but you meet the requirements that are set forth on this slide, then you can either ignore the reduction for headcount or wages or both. And so the way that the CARES Act was written here is even that these time periods don't match up necessarily at all to anything else we've just talked about. But if your employment declined between February 15th and April 26, 2020, and you restore all of the positions by June 30th, 2020, then there's no reduction due to headcount decline. In the same manner, if there was a decline in wages between February 15th and April 26, 2020, but you fully restore wages by June 30th, there's no reduction due to a wage decline. These rules appear to require a 100% restoration. So the prior rules that we talked about are kind of on a percentage basis, sliding scale. In this case, at least the way that they're written right now, it appears to be all or nothing. I do expect that we'll have some further guidance on that. It will hopefully make things a little bit more clear. Now, in terms of strategies, the first point that I would make is getting back to one of those common misconceptions, which is, well, even if I lay people off, even if I reduce their hours, if I restore them by June the 30th, then I'll be okay. It is possible that you would be okay in the sense that you could potentially get your loan forgiveness percentage back to 100%. But keep in mind, the starting point for loan forgiveness is what you actually paid in the 8-week period starting on the loan date. And so if you have furloughed employees and are not paying them wages, even if you restore those wages later, any of those wages that you do not pay in that 8-week period are by definition reducing the amount of your maximum loan forgiveness. So regardless of what the percentages are, if you're not paying your people in the 8-week period, then you are reducing the amount that could potentially be forgiven. And so that's one of the main pieces of advice I've been giving to our clients is, particularly for that payroll up to $100,000 on an annualized basis, which comes out to around $15,000 per employee over the 2-week period. There is really almost no reason for you not to be paying those employees, whether they are working or not, if those amounts can go into the calculation of loan forgiveness. If you don't pay your people during the 8-week period, then you're reducing your loan forgiveness amount, plain and simple. Related point on the second item, there's no prohibition at this time on accelerating pay. I don't know if we'll maybe see some of that in the forthcoming regulations. Again, the payroll costs are limited to $100,000 per employee on an annualized basis. But let's say that you normally provide some holiday bonuses. Is there any reason you couldn't, say pay employees an additional $1,000 per week if they're going to be under that $15,000 cap in the 8-week period? I don't see any prohibition right now, and you may be able to pay that money and get 100% forgiveness. You would have the employer side payroll tax, but pretty small amount in terms of what you might potentially be able to do. And then the last bullet point here, same thing on healthcare and retirement costs. I'm not seeing any prohibition right now. There's a great article that someone shared with me from Forbes last week, and I would recommend it to all of you. It was titled 10 Things We Need to Know About Paycheck Program Loan Forgiveness. And the very first question in that article was basically making sense of what the CARES Act said in terms of payroll, in terms of the eligible costs for forgiveness having to be incurred and paid during the 8-week period. The specific language is costs incurred and payments made within the 8-week period. So we do have a little bit of a question there in terms of, what if on the first day of the 8-week period, you're paying payroll that really represents hours that were worked in the 2 weeks prior. Or on the flip side, if you're at the end of the 8-week period and you have almost 2 weeks of payroll, but your actual payroll date ends up being the day after the 8-week period ends, we're still looking for a little bit of clarity there. My sense has been that we would just follow cash method because it would be so complicated to look at any other method. But we'll be anxiously looking for further clarity from the additional SBA and Treasury guidance on those points. I mentioned this when I was talking about wage reductions, but the reduction in loan forgiveness for wage reductions is only applicable to employees, and here's the key language again, who were paid not more than $100,000 in any pay period in 2019 on an annualized basis. And so just to give you an example of what that looks like, if you take an employee paid $52,000 per year, who at some point in the year received a $2,000 bonus, that employee, let's say that employee was paid biweekly, that employee would have been paid $4,000 in that payroll period, and that would equate to $104,000 on an annualized basis. And so for that employee, a wage reduction would not actually trigger the wage reduction percentage for the loan forgiveness amount. Now I'm probably saying this for the 5th time, but it's on purpose because it's this important. If you reduce those wages, you are still reducing the very starting point of loan forgiveness, which is the amount that you actually paid in the 8-week period. And so it's not that you could reduce that employee's wages without any consequences to you. It's just that in this example, that employee's wages could be reduced without the forgiveness reduction percentage being implemented. Now, I would add a note of caution, not only for these points, but also for some of the prior ones. I know that upcoming SBA and Treasury guidance will address some of these issues. And so the advice that we're giving you today is kind of the best advice that we have right now based on the guidance that's available. And Perry, I'll kick things back over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Will. And thanks everybody for sending in some questions. I was doing my best to keep up with the Q&A, and I answered a few of those as Will did as well. So if it moved from, if you're not seeing it in the open, it moved over to the answered where you can check what our response is there. And I know there's a few open ones which we can try to address, hopefully at the end of this if Will doesn't get to it. A couple of final points just to wrap up, and then we can answer questions. Record keeping, I think, is going to be very, very important here to keep accurate, detailed records with respect to qualifying costs and eligible expenses and what you're using, where the loan funds are going, in case there's any dispute down the road as to the amount of your forgiveness and whether something meets the definition of eligible expenditures. You're certainly going to need that backup payroll documentation. No formal guidance on documentation for the rent, utilities, and interest payments, but I think it's probably a good idea to make sure you're retaining copies of checks or getting canceled checks from bank records, saving confirmations of online payments, any evidence of payments incurred during this 8-week period, you need to keep detailed records of, and hopefully we'll get additional guidance on what may be required to put forth in order to receive the forgiveness. Okay, we've had several questions about, the Paycheck Protection Program is one of several programs that Congress has created in order to deal with COVID-19 um, pandemic. One is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. You see that at the very bottom of the slide deck. This was really the first big thing that Congress passed, and it provides sick leave to workers who otherwise would have work to do but can't get to work because of a COVID-19 reason. They're under doctor's orders to stay home. They're having to stay home with their kids because their childcare facilities closed, things like that. So recipients of the payroll protection loans, paycheck protection loans can still receive reimbursement for those credits paid out pursuant to that program. Reimbursements for amounts paid out pursuant to that program are separate and apart. So you wouldn't include those payments within your definition of payroll cost under this program we're talking about. Those are two completely separate things. You can, on your quarterly payroll tax return filed with the IRS, you can withhold whatever amount you paid out in sick leave pursuant to that law in order to be reimbursed for it. The Employee Retention Tax Credit was another program that was created by the CARES Act. Recipient of paycheck protection loans are not eligible for that tax credit. That's an either or scenario. Same thing with the employer payroll tax deferral program. Recipients of these loans that have any indebtedness forgiven are not eligible to take advantage of that payroll tax deferral program. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, that was the one I made reference to at the beginning, that's administered directly through the SBA, and this came out first. So I know many businesses went ahead and applied for this because at that time we didn't really know about this PPP program. You can apply and receive loans under both EIDL and PPP, but you can't sort of double dip and use loan funds for the same purpose. You can refinance an EIDL loan into a PPP loan if you've already received one. And if you're going to use EIDL loan funds for payroll costs and then seek a PPP loan, you must refinance it in that situation. So I would, if you've received an EIDL loan and a PPP, or you've received an EIDL loan and are in the queue or going to be applying for a PPP, I would just make sure that you talk with your banker about sort of the interplay between those two programs and how the loan funds can be used.
Perry, let me jump in. A couple of questions are coming in terms of whether you can use the payroll tax deferral until the loan is forgiven. And there is new guidance in the last week indicating that you can. I haven't seen all of that fleshed out yet, but it does look like, to answer some of the questions that are coming in, you would at least have a limited period of time from March 27th until the date that you receive confirmation of your loan forgiveness, that you would be able to at least use that on a limited basis.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for clarifying that, Will. And I think with that, we can answer any other questions that anyone has, to the extent we've still got some pending, Will.
Well, one thing I'll say is I've been watching the news just to see if anything was coming in while we're talking. I do see a release from 11 minutes ago saying that the White House and congressional Democrats have agreed on a deal, and it would be 310 billion in additional funds, with 50 billion targeted for smaller financial institutions to serve minority and other areas that are not served adequately. That's consistent with what we have seen over the weekend. This latest article that I'm reading, no idea if it's accurate, speculates that the Senate would take up the bill on Thursday and then it would go to the House of Representatives. I had seen news over the weekend indicating that they hoped it would be completed on Wednesday. So maybe this latest thing I'm seeing is not right. Hopefully it will get done a little earlier, but the good news is that it does seem like some progress is being made, and we should be back up and running pretty soon.
Thanks, Will. And there was one question that I answered in the Q&A box that I forgot to address in the eligibility portion at the beginning. And it was a question about, are you still eligible for this program if your business is currently, performing well, and the financials show that it's performing well. I've gotten this question from a few businesses, and there is a certification that you have to make on the application that I can't remember the exact language of it, but you have to make a certification that the loan funds are necessary for use for a COVID-19 reason. And so some have said, well, if my company is performing well, do I really need these funds? I would say that the law was intended to be very broad in the application of that, such that most businesses should be eligible to make that certification as long as there's some good faith basis to show that there's some impact, some negative impact on your business as a result of COVID-19 from, a revenue standpoint or something like that. There certainly could be, I think, situations where, you're in one of those unique industries where businesses has improved a great deal. You're in the business of, manufacturing, sanitation products or something like that. And you've seen a huge uptick in business where, you might be concerned about making that certification that you need these funds. But otherwise, if you've got a good faith basis, I think you should be able to make that certification.
Keely, maybe you can answer this question. One person has asked if copies of the webinar will be available later. I think that it's being recorded. Is that right? And can you clarify that?
Correct. We will send out the link to the recording and also the PowerPoint itself. Probably later this afternoon.
Another question has just come in asking if resignations count against you for headcount and wages. The way that I read the act and the guidance that's come out so far in terms of just a resignation for headcount purposes, I do think that you measure the total headcount, and as I mentioned earlier, the terminology is the number of full-time equivalents. So for headcount purposes, I do think that that you would have to take into account any resignation. For wage purposes, I would say that at this point that's not clear. If you read the act, literally, if you had an employee on the payroll for the entire first quarter, and then you employed that same individual for 1 week out of the 8-week period before that employee resigned, that would be a pretty significant wage reduction. Surely that's not what was intended. And hopefully we'll see some clarity on that in the guidance that's forthcoming. And I do hope that the guidance on loan forgiveness will be published before the 8-week period ends, or before the first 8-week periods end. And I hope that the guidance will come out sufficiently ahead of time to allow people like all of us on the call today and advisors all over the country to have some time to process the initial guidance so that it can be fleshed out, maybe modified or clarified as needed. I do think that will be coming hopefully rather soon, but I know we'll be seeing a lot more on all these issues. And certainly if you check back to our resources page or be on the lookout for emails from us, we'll certainly be back here to provide our advice. If there are no other questions, thank you all very much for joining us. Perry, any final thoughts?
No, thanks everybody for joining us. Hope everybody's business is holding up okay. Hope everyone's staying safe and healthy, and hopefully we're getting to a point where we can get back to normal pretty soon. But don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know if you have any questions.
And not only questions, but any kind of interesting experiences that you've had, we'd love to hear about them so that we can share that with others. Thanks everybody for joining us. Stay safe and healthy.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Hainsworth Sinclair Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.